The sentence spread like fire through the Comanche camps. They had a shot for every finger on the hand. And for a people who had spent a generation studying their enemies, who had spent a generation knowing exactly how long it took a white man to reload his rifle, that sentence meant something had changed, something they had not planned for, something they would need to understand. But here is the question that Walker's Creek really raises. Not how did the Rangers win that one fight, but why did it take until battles like Walker's Creek for Texans to begin finding a battlefield answer to Comanche mobility? Why did it take revolvers and a half-crazy young captain willing to charge uphill against 5 times his number just to survive a single afternoon on the Texas frontier? The Republic of Texas had an army. It had rangers. It had forts and treaties and desperate men willing to die for land they had barely finished claiming. And yet for decade after decade, the Comanche had ridden through all of it like it was not there. That is the question this documentary is going to answer. The people at the center of this story called themselves Numonu, the people. That is the word in their own language, and it is the word worth holding on to, because it tells you something about how they saw themselves in relation to everything around them. Not a tribe in the way the textbooks use the word. Not a nation in the way Europeans drew nations on maps. Not a kingdom with a capital and a treasury and a standing army. Something harder to see and much harder to fight. Comancheria, the zone of power they dominated, stretched across much of the southern plains, from the high plains of what is now Colorado and Kansas, down through western Oklahoma, across the Texas Panhandle, and south through parts of Texas. From that core, Comanche influence, raiding, trade, and horse traffic reached deep into northern Mexico, including Chihuahua and Coahuila. It was not a country with borders. It was a zone of power, and the difference between those two things is exactly why Texas could not stop them. A European-style government can be defeated. You find its capital, you burn it, you capture its king, and the thing collapses. Comancheria did not work that way. There was no capital, there was no king, there was no single treaty that, if broken, would unravel the whole structure. What there was instead was something more like a network. Dozens of autonomous bands spread across 800 miles of grass and canyon and river valley, each one capable of moving, fighting, trading, and disappearing back into the landscape on its own terms. To defeat that kind of power, you could not win one battle. You could not sign one treaty. You had to defeat everything at once. The horses, the buffalo, the knowledge of the land, the ability to move faster than any army could follow. And in 1844, in 1838, in 1820, no one knew how to do that yet. What made it all possible came down to 5 things that this documentary will follow, one by one. Horses, which the Comanche acquired around the late 1600s or early 1700s and mastered with extraordinary speed, becoming one of the most skilled mounted peoples on the continent. Buffalo, which fed them, clothed them, housed them, and gave them a surplus economy that could support raiders, hunters, diplomats, and warriors simultaneously. Mobility, the ability to move entire families across 500 miles of open plains and leave nothing behind but grass bent by hooves. Trade, a network that stretched from the markets of Santa Fe to the prairies of the Missouri River, giving the Comanche access to weapons, horses, and intelligence that no isolated frontier fort could match, and strategic violence, raids that could be targeted and calculated, but also devastating, used not only to take horses and captives, but to punish enemies, recover leverage, protect movement, and force distant settlements to calculate the cost of entering Comanche ground. Texas and the governments before it kept making the same mistake. They looked at the Comanche and saw a military problem. They sent soldiers. When soldiers failed, they sent more soldiers. What they were not prepared to understand was that the Comanche were not an army to be beaten. They were an economy to be dismantled. And the forces that would finally dismantle it were not primarily military at all. This is the story of how a people built something remarkable on the southern plains, how they held it for more than a century against Spain, Mexico, the Republic of Texas, and the United States, and how it was finally taken apart not through any single battle, but through the slow destruction of the world that made it possible. The buffalo would go, the grass would go, the open range would go, but the Nuhmuhnu would not go. The Comanche nation is still here, still centered in Oklahoma, still carrying the name forward. But to understand what survived, you have to understand what was built. And to understand what was built, you have to go back before the horses. The world the Comanche came from did not look like Comancheria. It did not look like anything the Spanish would have feared or the Texans would have struggled to name. It was colder, higher, harder, and quieter. And to find it, you have to go north and west, into the basin and range country of what is now Wyoming and Idaho and Nevada, into a world of sage flats and high desert valleys and mountain winters that could kill a person who had not grown up knowing exactly how to survive. The Comanche language belongs to the Uto-Aztecan family, one of the largest and most geographically spread language families in the Americas, stretching from the Great Basin of North America all the way south into Mesoamerica. Within that family, Comanche is most closely related to Shoshone. Not distantly related, not related in the way that English is related to Sanskrit, related the way two dialects of the same language are related. Close enough that linguists in the 19th and 20th centuries, when they began studying both systematically, found themselves looking at a degree of similarity that was striking. A Shoshone speaker and a Comanche speaker, meeting somewhere on the plains in the 1800s, could communicate. The languages had drifted, but not far, and that proximity in language points to something that the archaeology and the oral traditions and the historical record all tend to confirm, that the people who would become the Comanche were once part of the broader Shoshonean world of the Great Basin and the Rocky Mountain foothills. Historians use the word Numic to describe the larger population group, sometimes calling them the Numic peoples, from the word for person or people that appears in various forms across related languages. The Numic world before European contact was not a single unified culture. It was more like a constellation of related bands spread across an enormous territory, each one adapted to the specific conditions of the place it occupied, sharing linguistic roots and certain cultural practices, but not organized into anything resembling a confederacy or a centralized political structure. The Shoshone bands of what is now Wyoming and southern Idaho, the Ute bands of the Colorado Plateau, the Paiute of the Great Basin, and the people who would eventually separate and move south and east to become the Comanche were all, in some sense, cousins of one another, different enough to be distinct peoples, close enough that a common origin is not in serious dispute. What historians are more careful about is exactly when the separation happened, and exactly why. The honest answer is that the evidence becomes interpretive at this point. There are no written records from the pre-separation period. There is no Comanche account of the moment of divergence, no equivalent of a founding document. What there is the linguistic evidence, which suggests the split happened sometime in the late 1600s or very early 1700s, and the archaeological and ethno-historical evidence, which points to the southern Rocky Mountain foothills and the high plains of eastern Colorado as the zone where the people who would become the Comanche began to emerge as a distinct group. Some historians are more specific than that. Some are more cautious. The caution is probably the right instinct. We are working at the edge of what the evidence can clearly support. What can be said with more confidence is something about the world those ancestors inhabited before the shift. The Shoshonean bands of the Great Basin and the Mountain West were not plains people. They were people of a different kind of landscape, one that required a different kind of knowledge. They moved seasonally. They followed the availability of resources, pine nuts in the fall, roots and game in the spring and summer, mountain valleys in the warmer months, lower and more sheltered ground in the winter. They hunted deer and antelope and smaller game. They gathered plants. In some areas they hunted bison on the margins of the plains, driving them into arroyos or over low bluffs. But this was not yet the horse-mounted bison hunting that would define Comancheria. This was older, harder, more contingent, a hunt that required coordination and timing and detailed knowledge of animal behavior. But that happened on foot. That is the world worth sitting with for a moment, because it is the world the horse would transform. And the transformation only makes sense if you understand what came before it. A people who already knew how to read landscape, how to move through it seasonally, how to coordinate hunting without a rigid command structure, how to navigate the particular kind of authority that belongs not to a single chief, but to whoever happens to be the most skilled person for the task at hand. Those were not liabilities. They were exactly the skills that would explode into something new when horses entered the equation. There were also pressures building in that pre-horse world. Historians debate the specifics here too, but there is a general sense in the scholarship that the late 1600s were a period of movement and stress across the western interior of North America. Other groups were pushing south and east. The Sioux were beginning their own westward and southward expansion out of the Great Lakes region. There were resource pressures in the basin and range country. There were the very early tremors of the colonial disruption that Spanish expansion from the south was beginning to send rippling northward through trade networks and the displacement of peoples. The Comanche ancestors were not isolated from all of that. They were embedded in a world that was already moving, already shifting, already generating the kinds of pressures that push bands of people across landscapes in search of better ground. The foothills of the Rockies, the area around what is now eastern Colorado and southeastern Wyoming, seems to have been a zone of contact between the Shoshonean world to the north and west and the fringes of the southern plains to the east. People moving through that zone would have encountered a different kind of country than the basin and range homeland. More grass, more bison, a horizon that opened up in ways that the mountain valleys did not. And somewhere in that zone, in the late 1600s, something happened that historians have described in various ways: a gradual separation, a divergence, a pulling away of one group from the broader Shoshonean network, a group that would begin to think of themselves differently, to organize themselves differently, to move in a different direction. By the early 1700s, Spanish colonial sources from New Mexico are beginning to record encounters with a people on the southern margins of the plains who are not quite like anything they had cataloged before. They called them various names at first. The name Comanche came later, borrowed from a Ute term whose exact meaning has been debated, something roughly approximating those who are always against us or those who want to fight us. The Ute had reason to use a name like that, but the Spanish were beginning to understand that these people were different from the Utes, bands they already knew, and different in ways that mattered. The reason they were different, the reason the Spanish were noticing them at all, was not language. It was not migration pattern. It was not the ancient seasonal rhythms of the basin world they had come from. It was the horse, and what the horse did to a people who already knew how to move, already knew how to hunt without a standing army, already knew how to follow resources across a landscape and organize themselves without rigid hierarchy. What the horse did to that world is something the Spanish had no framework to predict and no strategy to contain. That is the next part of the story. The horse did not arrive all at once. That is the first thing worth understanding. There was no single morning when the Comanche woke up as mounted people. It was a process, and the process was uneven, and for a generation or two, the people living through it probably did not have words for what was changing because the change was happening faster than language could track it. The Spanish had brought horses to the Americas. That is well established. What is less often noted is that Spanish colonial policy in New Mexico was built in part on keeping horses out of indigenous hands. The reasoning was straightforward. A mounted enemy was a different kind of problem than a foot enemy. The Spanish understood this because they had watched it work for themselves. So the regulations existed. The prohibitions existed. And like most prohibitions placed on something that people desperately want, they did not hold. Horses spread northward through trade, through theft, through the escape of animals from ranches and missions, through the slow capillary action of exchange that moves things across landscapes regardless of what colonial administrators want to happen. By the mid-1600s, horses were already moving through Pueblo communities in New Mexico, and some indigenous groups were beginning to understand the power of this animal before Spanish officials fully realized what was happening. The Pueblo Revolt of 1680, when the Pueblo peoples drove the Spanish out of New Mexico for 12 years, did not create indigenous horse culture from nothing, but it greatly accelerated a process already moving through older trade networks. The Spanish fled south. Many of their horses did not follow, and after 1680, what had already been spreading became faster, wider, and harder for colonial authorities to control, moving through the southwest, the Great Basin, and the Rocky Mountain foothills. The people who would become the Comanche were positioned, by geography and by the existing trade relationships of the Shoshonean world, to receive horses relatively early in that spread. Historians place the Comanche acquisition of horses in the late 1600s or very early 1700s, and within a generation, perhaps within a single long lifetime, the effect was visible enough that Spanish sources in New Mexico were recording that something remarkable happening on the southern plains. Think about what a horse actually meant to a people who had been moving on foot. The practical arithmetic changes completely. A person on foot in the Great Basin or the mountain foothills can cover, on a good day, across good terrain, perhaps 15 to 20 miles. A person on horseback can cover 50, more if the terrain is open and the animal is rested. That is not a modest improvement, that is a transformation in the geometry of the world. Distances that had required multiple days of careful travel now took hours. A resource that had been too far to reach without overnight camp was suddenly accessible in a morning. A threat that had required days of warning to respond to was now something that could be met, or avoided, within the span of a day. The effect on hunting was immediate and profound. The bison herds of the southern plains were one of the great concentrations of protein in the pre-industrial world. Hundreds of thousands of animals, possibly millions, moving in seasonal patterns across an enormous grassland. On foot, hunting bison required elaborate coordination. Drives, surrounds, the use of landscape features, timing that had to be precise because you could not catch a running bison without terrain working in your favor. On horseback, the calculus shifted entirely. A skilled rider could pull alongside a running bison and place an arrow or a lance with a precision that foot hunting simply could not replicate. The hunt became faster, more flexible, more individual. It also became more dangerous, because a bison at full run is a large and unpredictable animal, and a horse carries its rider into the middle of that. But the yields improved, and the yields are what fed families. Feeding families more effectively meant families could grow. It meant the movement of families could accelerate. In the foot travel world, everything a family owned had to be carried or dragged. Dogs pulling travois were the primary means of moving material goods. There are real limits on what a dog can pull. A horse can pull dramatically more, and carry more on its back, and cover more ground per day. The result was that the scale of what a Comanche family could own and transport expanded considerably. Larger lodges became possible because the poles could be moved, more stored food, more trade goods, more material goods of all kinds became portable in ways they had not been before. And here is where horse ownership began to connect directly to something deeper than logistics. A man with many horses was not merely more mobile. He was more capable of feeding his family in hard seasons. He could move faster when a drought or a hard winter made one region untenable and another attractive. He could trade from a position of strength. He could equip warriors more effectively. Horses became, within the Comanche world, the primary measure of wealth. Not land, not gold, not stored grain, horses. The size of a man's herd reflected his standing, his skill, his network of relationships. A young man who wanted to establish himself, to attract a wife, to be taken seriously in counsel, accumulated horses. He did this through raiding, through successful hunting, through strategic gift-giving and trade. The whole social economy of prestige and authority reoriented itself around the animal. Raiding had always been a part of life in the pre-horse world, but the horse made raiding into something of an entirely different order. A raiding party on horseback could strike a target that was 2 days' ride away, take what they came for, and be a day's ride in the other direction before any response could be organized. The speed of mounted raiding was genuinely difficult to counter without an equivalent mounted response. Spanish presidios, Apache camps, Wichita villages, later Anglo settlements, all of them operated on timelines that mounted raiders could exploit and escape. before the alarm translated into pursuit. And the raided horses became more horses, which funded more raids, which produced more horses. There was a momentum to it that, once started, was difficult to interrupt. Defensively, the horse offered similar advantages. A mounted community could disperse rapidly in the face of a threat, scatter across the plains in directions that were difficult to follow, reassemble at a prearranged location when the danger had passed. The plains themselves became a kind of ally. A landscape that looked featureless to outsiders was, to people who had spent their lives learning it, a mapped world of water sources, seasonal grass, shelter from weather, and routes that could be traveled quickly or made deliberately hard to follow. What all of this produced, within a generation or two of acquiring the horse, was a people whose capabilities had expanded faster than their neighbors could adapt to. And that asymmetry, that gap between what the Comanche could now do and what the peoples around them could anticipate or answer, is where the larger story begins to take shape. The question that the historians and the Spanish colonial records and the later Comanche oral traditions all circle around in their different ways is not just what the horse did to Comanche daily life, it is what the horse did to Comanche power. And that is a question that leads south, onto the southern plains, into a confrontation with peoples who had been there before them, and with a colonial empire that had been confident, until this moment, that it understood the country it was trying to control. The horse changed the geometry of distance. But distance is only the beginning, because once you can move, the next question is where you choose to move to, and what you do when you get there. And on the southern plains in the early 1700s, a new kind of answer begins to appear in the record. Not a kingdom, not a republic, not a nation-state with a border you can draw in ink and defend with walls. Something else. A zone of power that expands and contracts like a living thing. Historians later gave it a name, Comancheria. It helps to be clear about what that word means and what it does not mean. Comancheria was not a capital city with roads radiating out from it. It was not a single centralized government issuing orders across hundreds of miles. It was not a fixed border on a map where one step over the line meant you had entered foreign soil. It was, instead, a wide sphere of influence, an area where the Comanche could decide what was safe, what was costly, what was possible, and what was not. A place where travelers adjusted their plans because they knew who held the advantage. A place where trade moved because it had permission to move. A place where enemies learned, sometimes quickly and sometimes too late, that the open plains were not empty. To make the scale legible to a modern American audience, you can think of it like this. At its height in the 18th and early 19th centuries, Comanche power touched much of the Texas Panhandle and the South Plains, reached west into eastern New Mexico, stretched north into what is now western Oklahoma, and pushed up into parts of Kansas and Colorado along the Arkansas River country. It was not uniform. It was not the same in every decade, but it was big enough that a person could travel for days across grassland and broken river country and still be inside the world where Comanche horsemen could appear with little warning, and where local communities, Spanish, Pueblo, Wichita, Apache, later Mexican and Anglo, planned their lives around that possibility. Picture the geography. To the south and west, the Llano Estacado, the staked plains, flat, dry, and punishing if you do not know where the water is. To the north, the Arkansas River corridor, a long, usable highway through the plains that connected to distant markets. To the east, the cross timbers, a belt of scrub oak and rough terrain that could slow an army and hide a party moving light, and running through it all, the rivers and tributaries that mattered more than any border. The Canadian, the Red, the Brazos, the Colorado, the Pecos. In an open country, water is not just a resource, it is a schedule. It decides when you can move, where you can camp, where you can gather, where you can trade, and where you cannot survive. This is where the meaning of Comancheria begins to sharpen. The Comanche did not own this region in the way a modern government owns land through surveys and deeds. They controlled it through access. They knew the routes between water. They knew the grass, the breaks, the sheltering draws, the places where a herd could be kept alive, and the places where it would die. and they could move across that knowledge faster than most outsiders could respond. That is a different kind of power than a fort on a hill. It is the power of being able to appear, to vanish, and to reappear where you are not expected. Mobility held the whole thing together. Not just mobility in the sense of having horses, but mobility as a way of organizing life. Comanche families did not sit still. They moved seasonally, following the logic of pasture, bison movement, and weather. Summer and early fall could mean broad hunts and large gatherings when resources were abundant and travel was easier. Winter could mean smaller, more sheltered camps, tucked into river bottoms or breaks where there was wood, water, and some protection from wind. Spring meant herds needing good grass and careful attention. The Comanche were not wandering randomly. They were moving along patterns learned over generations, patterns that were flexible enough to adjust to drought, pressure from enemies, or opportunity in trade. That local knowledge is difficult to overstate. To a newcomer, the plains could look like one long, repeating horizon. To people who lived inside it, it was a detailed map. The difference between a route that had water and one that did not could be the difference between a successful journey and a disaster, and the Comanche used that difference. They could take routes that Spanish soldiers, even mounted soldiers, struggled to use because the logistics were wrong for them. A large expedition needs wagons. Wagons need water and grass. Wagons move slowly. A Comanche party moving light could run on a different clock, and that clock, speed, became the enforcement mechanism of Comancheria. If you were a trader, speed mattered because the Comanche could decide whether you reached your market. If you were a New Mexican village, speed mattered because a raiding party could be in and out before a presidio could assemble. If you were an enemy people, speed mattered because the Comanche could choose the time and place of contact and could refuse battle as easily as they could offer it. Outsiders often wrote about Comanche raids as if raiding was a kind of chaos, but in many cases it functioned like policy. It was a way of extracting wealth, especially horses, of signaling dominance, of punishing communities that resisted, and of creating a reputation that did part of the work for them. Because intimidation is also a form of infrastructure. A zone of power this large cannot be held by violence alone. Violence can burn, but it does not administer. What held Comancheria together was a mixture: the threat of force, the reality of force when needed, and the steady pull of trade. The Comanche sat across key routes that linked the interior of the continent. They could connect to New Mexico's markets and livestock. They could connect to the Wichita and other farming peoples on the plains who produced corn and other goods. They could connect, indirectly and sometimes directly, to French and later American trade goods moving down from the north and east, metal tools, weapons, cloth, items that became part of everyday life and status. Comancheria was not sealed off. It was a crossroads, and the Comanche, because they were mobile and mounted and numerous enough to enforce their terms in many places, could shape what that crossroads looked like. In practice, this meant tolls without toll gates, permission without paperwork, agreements made in councils and renewed through gift-giving, kinship ties, and mutual advantage. A trading relationship could be a kind of peace treaty, and a peace treaty could be a kind of business arrangement. If you were Spanish in New Mexico in the mid-1700s, you might find yourself in the uncomfortable position of needing Comanche peace because war was too expensive and too uncertain. If you were a smaller indigenous community living on the edge of Comanche range, you might trade because the alternative was isolation, or worse, becoming the training ground where young warriors proved themselves. This raises the question that sits at the center of the mystery: how do you sustain such a wide sphere without a centralized bureaucracy, without a standing army, without tax collectors, without written laws sent down from a capital? Part of the answer is that Comanche society did not need those tools to do what it was doing. Bureaucracy is a technology for controlling people at a distance when your system depends on fixed places, fields, cities, storehouses. Comanche power depended on movement, and movement can be coordinated through relationships rather than paperwork. Bands could make decisions quickly and locally. They could split and regroup. They could gather in larger numbers for war, or for hunting, or for trade, and then disperse again before resources were strained. Authority tended to be persuasive rather than coercive, earned rather than imposed. A leader had to keep people with him by proving competence. Good judgment, generosity, success in war or diplomacy, the ability to bring in horses and trade goods, the ability to keep families alive through hard seasons. If he failed, people could leave. That sounds unstable to outsiders, but it can also be resilient. It means a bad decision does not necessarily ruin an entire nation. It means power is distributed in a way that can survive shocks, and the Comanche faced shocks constantly. Drought cycles, disease outbreaks that moved through the plains world with devastating effect, pressure from other mounted peoples who were also adapting, Spanish campaigns, shifting trade patterns. Yet the system endured for generations because it was built around adaptability. Another part of the answer is that Comancheria did not need to be uniform to be real. It could be strong in the river corridors and looser in the far edges. It could be absolute in a season and contested in another. It could depend on who was moving and why. A New Mexican trader with the right relationships might pass safely where a military patrol would be attacked. A small party could slip through a corridor that an army could not. Power was not just territory. It was the ability to make other people calculate risk. And that is the final piece: rapid concentration. A Comanche camp could be dispersed over miles during a hunt and still be able to assemble fighters quickly when needed. News traveled fast along kin networks and through riders who could cover long distances in a day. A threat could be met not by holding a line, but by appearing where the enemy did not expect resistance. That kind of responsiveness is hard to see if you are looking for forts and flags, but it is visible in the way Spanish and later Mexican sources talk about the plains. With caution, with frustration, with the repeated admission that punitive expeditions rarely achieved what they were supposed to achieve. So when we say Comancheria, we are talking about a lived system, not a drawn boundary. A horse-powered order that shaped the southern plains from the early 1700s into the 1800s, a system held together by seasonal movement, by deep geographic knowledge, by trade, by the management of fear, and by the practical ability to go where others could not go fast enough to matter. And now the pressure tightens, because the next question is unavoidable. A zone of power this large needs food, it needs grass. It needs horses in the tens of thousands and bison in numbers that can sustain families year after year. How do you move an entire society, women, children, elders, lodges, dogs, herds, across a continent-sized grassland without breaking it? And what happens when the animals that make the whole system possible begin to vanish? The answer starts with an animal that outsiders kept misunderstanding. To many Europeans and later Americans, the buffalo was a resource, a thing to be counted, harvested, converted into hides and tallow and profit. To the Comanche, the buffalo was closer to an infrastructure. It was food, yes, but it was also clothing, and shelter, and tools, and trade. It was the center post of a moving world. When a Comanche hunting band brought down bison, they were not just bringing meat into camp, they were stocking a pantry that could travel. Fresh meat could be eaten quickly, but much of it could be dried into jerky, mixed with fat, made into portable stores that lasted. In a country without fixed granaries, that mattered. It meant a family could move when it needed to move and still eat. The hide became winter warmth and everyday clothing, robes and leggings, moccasins. The hair could be used. The sinew became thread and bowstring. Horn could become cups and spoons and handles. Bones could become scrapers and tools. The stomach could be used as a container. Dung could be dried for fuel when wood was scarce. Even the rawhide had a second life, cut into ropes, used as lariats, tightened into shields, stretched into covers. And then there is the lodge, the teepee, so often treated in popular culture like a symbol more than a technology, was a practical answer to a hard problem. How do you build a home that can withstand wind and sudden weather and still be taken down, loaded, moved, and raised again quickly? Buffalo hide, properly prepared, was part of that answer. It was not just a roof. It was insulation. It was weatherproofing. It was mobility made livable. This is what it meant to live inside a buffalo economy. Not an economy of coin, but an economy of conversion, where a large animal could be turned into a whole household's material life. And because it could be converted into trade goods, robes, hides, prepared leather, the buffalo was also a bridge outward. It connected Comanche camps to markets far away, to New Mexico and to the river towns and to trading posts that would come later. It connected the hunt to iron tools, to cloth, to firearms and ammunition in the 19th century, to everything that could not be made on the plains. But the buffalo alone does not make an empire. The buffalo is the center. The horse is the engine. We have already said the horse changed the geometry of distance. Here is what that looks like when you measure it in daily life. Horses turned a bison hunt into something more reliable and more efficient. They turned scouting into a wider circle. They turned the gathering of firewood and water into a smaller burden. They turned a family's possessions into something that could be carried without breaking backs. Before the horse, a dog travois could move a camp, but not quickly and not with the same capacity. With horses, a household could carry more hides, more tools, more food stores, more children, more elders, and still keep moving. And horses were not only a way to move, they were a way to store wealth. On the plains, you could not stack silver in a bank. You could not fence fields and call them yours, but you could count horses. You could give them. You could trade them. You could use them to create obligations, alliances, marriages, peace. A large herd meant security in bad seasons and status in good ones. It meant a leader could be generous, and generosity was not decoration, it was governance. A man who could distribute horses could attract followers. A band that could replace losses quickly could take risks others could not afford. And horses were a kind of insurance. They were also a kind of weapon. A mounted fighter has options a foot fighter does not. He can choose contact or refuse it. He can strike, withdraw, circle, return. In open country, the ability to decide when the fight happens is often more important than the ability to win a single fight. Comanche war parties used that logic again and again, not because they loved battle, but because battle was one tool inside a larger system of acquiring animals, protecting herds, and enforcing terms on a landscape where no courthouse and no sheriff could follow. This is where the horse becomes more than transport. It becomes strategy. Horses multiplied Comanche reach into a trade world that included Spanish New Mexico, French, and later American traders, settled indigenous farming peoples, and Mexican communities to the south. They could bring in captives, yes, and hides, and meat, and they could bring out horses in numbers that startled outside observers. There were decades when Comanche power was described, even by their enemies, as horsepower in the most literal sense. They did not just ride, they managed herds, bred, captured, traded, and redistributed them, and because horses reproduce, wealth could grow. A herd could become a surplus could become leverage. That leverage was not abstract, it shaped diplomacy. A peace agreement could involve horses given as gifts. A trade relationship could depend on Comanche willingness to supply horses to a partner and deny them to an enemy. Horses could move north and east into other indigenous nations and into American markets, and they could move west and south into New Mexico and Mexico. Comancheria sat in the middle of this circulation like a gate that could open or close. But none of this works if you imagine the Comanche world as warriors alone. The strength of Comancheria was not just that young men could ride fast, it was that families could move and survive while doing it. A Comanche camp was not a fort, it was a moving town. Women did an enormous share of the work that made mobility possible, processing meat, preparing hides, maintaining the material life of the household, managing the rhythms of daily survival. Elders carried knowledge, where the water would hold late in the season, where blizzards hit hardest, where grass came early, where enemies tended to travel. Children grew up inside a training system that did not need classrooms. They learned horses by living with horses. They learned the plains by moving across it. When conditions were good, when the grass was high and the bison were close, bands could come together into larger gatherings. Those gatherings were social, political, economic. They were where marriages were arranged, where disputes could be settled, where trade could happen at scale, where leaders could persuade rather than command. And then, when resources thinned or danger increased, camps could split again into smaller, faster units that were harder to find and easier to sustain. This was resilience, built into the calendar, and it depended on two living foundations: healthy buffalo herds and open movement. If the bison moved, you moved. If drought burned a pasture, you shifted to another drainage. If an enemy pressed one corridor, you used a different one. If a trading opportunity opened in New Mexico, a party could go. If the Arkansas corridor promised goods from the north, you could reach it. Comanche's strength lay in being able to treat the plains as a set of options instead of a trap. Ecology, subsistence, and trade were not separate topics. They were the same system viewed from different angles. The buffalo needed grass and water and room to move. The horses needed grass and water and shelter in bad weather. The people needed both animals, and they needed the knowledge of where each would be when the season turned. A Comanche leader who could not keep horses alive through winter, who chose poor campsites, who failed to anticipate bison movement, would not remain a leader for long. Success was measured not only in raids, but in full bellies, warm robes, and herds that increased instead of collapsed. This is why the later American assumption that you could break Comanche power by winning a few battles kept failing for so long. Because what sustained Comancheria was not a single army, it was a functioning plains economy, a moving logistics system, a way of life that turned open space into strength. But it also explains the danger, because a system built on herds is only as strong as the herds. A system built on movement is only as strong as the ability to move. And in the 19th century, those two conditions, buffalo abundance and open range, would come under pressure from forces that did not care about Comanche terms. Markets that reached across oceans, settler populations that turned grass into fences and fields, military campaigns that began to target not just warriors but the foundations beneath them. So keep that question in your mind as we move forward. If buffalo and horses and moving families were the true engine of Comanche power, what happens when outsiders begin to close the range, narrow the water, and hunt the buffalo not as infrastructure but as inventory? If you want to understand why outside governments kept misreading the Comanche, you have to start with a simple problem of translation. Not language translation, political translation. Spanish officials and later Texans and Americans kept asking the same question in different forms. Who is the chief? Who can sign for all of you? Who can order you to stop? And the Comanche answer, most of the time, was that there was no single door you could knock on. There were many doors, there were many fires, and each fire had its own circle. Comanche society was built around extended families and bands, mobile communities that could be large or small depending on the season, the grass, the buffalo, and the danger. These bands were not little fragments of a larger nation waiting for orders from a capital. They were the nation in motion. They formed, split, merged, shifted their campsites and their alliances, and did it without breaking the larger Comanche identity. That flexibility was not an accident. It was a survival technology. A rigid central government works best when people stay put, when roads lead to one place, when taxes can be collected, when grain is stored behind walls. The southern plains did not offer those conditions. The plains offered distance, weather, and animals that moved when they wanted to move. The Comanche built a political structure that moved as well. So how did leadership work? Not through monarchy, not through a chain of command where one man could give an order and every camp would obey. Comanche leaders, war leaders, peace chiefs, headmen, rose through prestige, through skill, through proven judgment, through generosity, and above all, through consent. A man could be brave in battle and still fail as a leader if he could not persuade others to follow him. A man could have a famous name and still lose influence if he made bad decisions, if he led people to poor hunting, if he wasted horses, if he brought danger down on families. And a man could gain influence not by taking but by giving. A leader who could distribute horses, food, trade goods, who could host others, who could settle disputes, who could make relatives and allies feel protected, became a leader because people chose to stand near his lodge. That word, chose, matters. Because in a Comanche camp, no one was held by paperwork. No one was bound by a permanent enlistment. If you did not like a man's leadership, you did not have to stage a coup. You could simply leave. You could ride to a relative's camp. You could join another band. You could take your horses and your household and your labor and remove them from his influence. Authority in that world had to be earned and re-earned. This is one reason outsiders found Comanche diplomacy so confusing. A Spanish governor might sit across from a respected Comanche headman, exchange gifts, make promises, and imagine he had made peace with the Comanche. Then, a month later, a raiding party would strike a ranch or a caravan, and the governor would declare the treaty broken. He would demand to know why the chief lied. But from the Comanche side, that may not have been the same decision at all. A leader could speak sincerely for the people who chose to follow him, and still not be able, or even try, to control what another band decided to do 200 miles away. Especially when that other band had its own pressures, hungry horses, a bad hunt, a debt to repay, an opportunity to seize. This is not to say Comanche bands were lawless or chaotic. They had norms, expectations, reputations that lasted. They had kinship obligations. They had consequences for bad behavior. They had memory. A man known for reckless violence could find himself isolated. A band known for keeping terms could become a preferred trade partner. And Comanche people could coordinate on a large scale when they wanted to. That is the key point. Decentralized did not mean disorganized, it meant selective. When the buffalo were abundant and the grass was high, bands could gather into larger concentrations. Those gatherings could create something like a temporary capital, not a city of stone, but a place where many camps came together, where trade could happen at volume, where marriages tied bands together, where disputes could be mediated, where a major war party could be proposed and assembled. And that proposal mattered, because a Comanche war leader did not draft men. He recruited, he persuaded, he offered a plan that sounded wise, a target that sounded worth the risk, a promise of horses, or captives, or revenge, or security. A good leader could attract followers across band lines. A poor leader would ride out with only a small handful, or ride out at all and find his support melt away when the danger became real. This system had strengths that outsiders underestimated. It made the Comanche hard to decapitate. In European-style warfare, you can sometimes end a war by capturing a capital or killing a king. Comancheria had no single point that could be seized to make everything stop. A raid could be punished, a village could be struck, a leader could be killed, and yet the system could continue because it was not built around one office. It was built around many households with horses and knowledge and options. It also made the Comanche remarkably adaptive. If one corridor became dangerous, you could reroute. If one trading partner failed, you could seek another. If Spanish presidios strengthened in one region, bands could shift their trade and raiding patterns elsewhere. The Comanche could concentrate force when they needed to, and dissolve back into smaller units when it suited them, not as a retreat, but as a strategy. But decentralization also had limits, and the Comanche lived with those limits. A leader could make peace, and another band could still raid. A leader could promise safe passage, and a young war party might see an unguarded herd as an invitation. A band could decide that diplomacy was profitable, while another decided that raiding was necessary. And when outsiders responded with collective punishment, when they struck any Comanche they could find for the actions of a different group, those internal distinctions could collapse into a single, widening cycle of violence. Trade had its own version of the same problem. Comanche bands traded widely, into New Mexico, toward the Arkansas, down into Mexico, moving hides, horses, captives, and later manufactured goods. But trade required trust, and trust required reliability. A decentralized system could be very reliable at the level of a specific relationship. This Chandon band, this trader, this set of promises, and still look unreliable to a distant government trying to impose one blanket agreement over 1,000 miles of prairie. This is the misunderstanding that kept repeating. Outsiders kept thinking Comanche leaders were either kings or liars. Either they had absolute control and refused to use it, or they were pretending to have influence they did not possess. The reality was more subtle, and, in its own way, more modern. Comanche leadership was real, but it was relational. It lived in reputation, in kinship, in generosity, in the ability to make other people believe that following you was safer and more profitable than not following you. And here is the pressure this creates for the story ahead. If you are Spain, or Mexico, or the Republic of Texas, and your whole idea of border control depends on treaties signed by a small number of recognized authorities, what do you do with a power that cannot be reduced to one signature? What do you do with a horse empire that can make peace in one season and raid in another? Not because it is inconsistent, but because different bands are making different calculations. This is where force enters the equation. Because when governments cannot find one leader to bind the whole, they often reach for the tool they understand best. And Spain, first, would learn how little force could do on the open plains when the people you are trying to control are not anchored to a town, but to horses, grass, and the next horizon. Spain entered the southern plains with an old confidence. In the 1700s, Spain knew how to hold territory, the way European empires held territory. You build missions, you build presidios, you settle families, you string those points together with roads and paperwork and priests and soldiers, and you call that a frontier. But the Comanche frontier was not a line, it was a moving field. Spanish officials used a word they understood: dominion. The Comanche lived inside a different reality: range. The range of a horse, the range of a buffalo herd, the range of a band that could pack up at dawn and be gone by noon, leaving nothing behind but hoofprints and ashes. And this is where Spain began to learn the limits of force. Early on, Spanish campaigns against the Comanche had a familiar shape on paper. A governor in New Mexico or Texas would gather soldiers, militia, and allied Indian auxiliaries. They would march or ride out to punish raids, recover captives, reassert authority, and make an example. It was the logic of the presidio. If you can strike back hard enough, often enough, the enemy will stop. But what does strike back mean when your opponent is not sitting behind walls? On the plains, the Comanche did not have to defend a fixed town. They did not have to protect stored grain. Their wealth could move, their families could move, and their war parties could choose the time and place of contact. If Spanish troops came out heavy and slow, with supply lines that could be cut, the Comanche could simply not be there. If Spanish cavalry pressed too far into open country, they could be pulled into distance and thirst, into the long spaces where water decided who lived and who did not. Spanish commanders learned something that would become a pattern for every government that tried to master Comancheria. You could win a fight and still lose the problem. You could ride out, burn a camp, take a few horses, and return to the presidio declaring victory, and then the raids would resume, sometimes not even as revenge, but as business as usual, because the larger system that produced Comanche power had not been touched. The crisis points came when Spanish plans collided with Comanche geography. In the 1750s and 1760s, Spain tried to push missions and settlements into contested country north of San Antonio, toward the rivers that run into the hill country and beyond. The idea was simple: convert and concentrate native peoples in missions, use presidios to protect them, create stable communities that would anchor Spanish claims. And on paper, one of those efforts looked like a success. A mission and presidio were established near the San Saba River, an outpost meant to extend Spanish influence and, importantly, to draw in indigenous allies. Spain was trying to build a buffer system: friendly peoples near the missions, hostile raiders kept at a distance, commerce and Christianity radiating outward. But buffers only work if everyone agrees to be buffered. San Saba became a magnet for conflict. It sat in a world of shifting alliances and old grudges, where some groups sought Spanish support against enemies, and others saw Spanish presence itself as the threat. For the Comanche, The mission system could look less like charity and more like an attempt to rearrange the map, settling people who might become Spanish clients, building a fortified node in a region where movement was power. The San Saba mission was attacked and destroyed, the Presidio nearby held, but the mission burned, and the project was shattered in a way that did not fit Spanish expectations. This was not a small raid for a few horses. It was a message about reach, about what could be hit, and what could not be reliably protected, even with soldiers close by. Spain responded the way empires respond when embarrassed on the frontier, with punishment. A large retaliatory expedition went out in 1759, aimed at Comanche communities farther north. It moved into a country that did not feed armies easily, and it struggled to impose a decisive outcome. Some fighting occurred, claims and counterclaims were made, and Spanish officials tried to present the campaign as restoring honor. But honor did not keep settlers safe. The raids did not simply stop. The presidios did not suddenly become walls that held back an entire horse. People. San Saba was not just an isolated tragedy. It revealed instability baked into Spanish strategy. Because the Spanish model depended on permanence. Missions depended on people staying put. Farms depended on predictable seasons and protected fields. Roads depended on traffic that could be policed. But Comancheria operated on mobility and choice. If danger came, you did not defend a town, you moved the town. If trade became better in another direction, you rerouted the trade. If a Spanish governor offered peace terms that benefited one band, another band might ignore them and raid anyway, because their needs were different and their calculations were local. And Spanish officials noticed something else. Their enemies were getting better at being enemies. The Comanche were not fighting with an old static toolkit. The horse had transformed how fast they could strike and how far they could reach. Raiding was not only violence, it was acquisition. Horses, captives, weapons, and information moved through networks that did not run through Spanish customs houses. Comanche bands could take horses in Texas, trade them toward New Mexico, acquire firearms and metal goods through multiple channels, and return to the plains with their power increased. Meanwhile, Spanish cavalry on the northern frontier was often underfunded and thinly spread, garrisoning presidios that were far apart and expected to do everything at once: escort, patrol, respond, negotiate, punish. A presidio could defend its walls. It could not defend an entire ranching district. It could not be everywhere at once. And it could not easily catch a war party that chose to vanish into the grasslands. This is where the turn happens. Not all at once, not cleanly, but it happens. By the late 1700s, Spanish authorities increasingly leaned into a tool they had used before, but now with new urgency: diplomacy backed by commerce. If you cannot crush a mobile power, you try to manage it. You try to redirect it. You try to make peace profitable. So Spain began to do things that sound at first like weakness, but were often the only practical form of strength available on that frontier. They negotiated, they offered gifts, they opened regulated trade, they tried to turn raids into transactions, violence into relationships, enemies into partners who had something to lose if the relationship broke. Gifts were not just generosity, they were policy. A Spanish official might distribute tobacco, cloth, metal tools, maybe weapons in some contexts, trying to establish himself as a reliable source of goods. He was buying something. He was buying time. He was buying predictability. He was buying a channel through which grievances could be spoken before they became raids. And trade cut both ways. For Comanche bands, Spanish markets could be useful. Comancheria needed metal, cloth, firearms, ammunition, and later other manufactured goods. It also needed outlets for the products of the plains economy: horses, hides, and, in a brutal reality of the era, captives who were absorbed into households ransomed, traded, or sold across a borderlands slave market that implicated many peoples and settlements. The borderlands were not clean. They were a web of need and opportunism and survival. Spain's diplomats began to understand that peace with the Comanche was not a single document. It was a repeating exchange. You maintained it with ongoing contact, with trade fairs, with envoys, with gifts, with the careful recognition of important headmen. while also knowing that recognition did not create a king. Force still existed. Raids were still answered, expeditions still rode out, presidios still fired their cannon when alarm bells rang. But gradually, Spanish strategy admitted what it could not say out loud. Force alone could not defeat Comanche power on the plains. Not because the Comanche were invincible. They were not. They suffered losses, disease, internal disputes, and hard winters like everyone else. But because the Spanish state could not concentrate enough power for long enough, across enough distance, to break a system built on horses, kinship, and mobility. And that raises the question that sits under everything that follows. If diplomacy and trade become the only workable tools against a mobile horse empire, what happens to the borderlands themselves? What happens to missions and presidios when the most powerful force in the region cannot be fenced, only negotiated with? When peace depends on gifts and ongoing relationships, who controls the terms? Spain, or the people who can simply ride away? Because once Spain began to bargain with Comancheria instead of trying to conquer it outright, the frontier stopped being a line Spain drew on a map. It became a space of constant negotiation. And in that space, the Comanche did not just survive Spanish power, they learned to use it. They learned which governors could be pressured, which trade routes could be influenced, which settlements could be raided, which could be spared, and how the promise of peace could be leveraged into the very thing that made Comancheria expand. Spain had arrived believing the northern frontier would be shaped by forts and priests. What it found was that the plains were being shaped by horses and choices, and the rest of the story is what happens when other governments, Mexico, Texas, the United States, inherit Spain's dilemma and decide, again and again, that they can solve it with force, only to discover that the Comanche had already turned the open country itself into a kind of fortress. The open country became a fortress, but it was not an empty fortress. It was crowded with peoples who knew the rivers, the springs, the breaks, the caprock, the long distances between shade and water. And when the Comanche range expanded, it did not simply push against Spain. It pressed into other native worlds that had long existed on the southern plains. This is where the story gets harder to tell cleanly, because it refuses to be a simple line of Indians versus settlers, or tribe versus empire. Power on the plains was also native-to-native competition, over buffalo, over horses, over the safest travel corridors, and over the places where a family could winter without being found. In the early 1700s, before Comancheria reached its height, Apache groups held important positions across the region, especially the people often described in Spanish records as the Llanero Apache and related bands. They were not one unified nation with one leader. They were networks of families and bands with their own politics, their own enemies, their own trading partners. Some ranged far onto the plains. Some stayed closer to the mountains and the river valleys. Some allied with one Spanish post while fighting another. Conditions changed, and strategies changed with them. Then horses changed the math. Comanche bands, building a life around horse herds and mobile hunting, began to dominate the central southern plains in ways that affected everyone else, and one of the clearest results was pressure on Apache groups who had once used many of the same grasslands and river systems. It was not always a single decisive war with a beginning and an end. It was a long, uneven shifting of risk, a gradual turning of certain routes into danger zones, a slow realization that a camp that had been safe for a generation could become exposed in a single season. Think about what control meant out there. It did not mean fences. It meant knowledge and presence. Control meant you could follow the buffalo without being harassed off the herd. It meant you could move your horses to good grass and still sleep at night. It meant you could travel between water sources without riding into an ambush. It meant you had allies, people who would warn you, trade with you, take in your relatives, or ride with you if a revenge party came. And the Comanche, by the middle of the 1700s, were getting very good at that kind of control. Horse wealth was not just property, it was strategy. A band with large herds could move farther and faster. It could recover from losses. It could mount larger war parties. It could trade for guns and ammunition in one direction and for captives and livestock in another. It could absorb a bad year and still have options. The buffalo economy mattered here too. A buffalo range was not only meat, it was hides for trade, robes for winter, sinew for equipment, and a mobile pantry that followed the seasons. The best hunting grounds became the center of gravity for entire societies, and when Comanche bands held the best access, especially in the wide country between the Arkansas River and the Balcones Escarpment, and across the Canadian Red and Brazos River systems, it changed what was possible for everyone else. For many Apache groups, that meant displacement from parts of the open plains and a shift toward the edges, toward the plains to mountain borderlands, toward the Pecos country, toward the South Plains margins, toward places where mobility was still possible, but the risk calculus looked different. Some Apache bands fought to hold space, some sought new alliances, some leaned harder into raiding, some tried to stabilize relations with Spanish settlements as a counterweight. None of those choices were permanent identities. They were responses to pressure, and the pressure did not come from one source. Comanche expansion coincided with other forces that were hitting native life across North America. Epidemic disease that could tear through kin networks, changing access to firearms, the rise and fall of trade partners, drought cycles, and the relentless tug of Spanish, and later Mexican, settlement and livestock economies creeping north and west. In a world like that, older hostilities could flare, but so could partnerships. Enemies could trade, allies could fall out. A band that fought you one year might negotiate the next, because the buffalo moved, because horses were stolen, because a leader died, because a Spanish governor changed, because the needs of families changed. What we can say, with confidence, is that Comanche power on the southern plains was built in part on making the central plains unsafe for rivals and safe for themselves. Safety is not a feeling, it is an infrastructure. It is scouts, information, relationships, and the ability to respond quickly. It is knowing who is camped on the next river. It is being able to punish a theft and recover losses. It is being able to raid without being caught. And over time, the Comanche increasingly owned that infrastructure. But it would be a mistake to describe this as a permanent blood feud between Comanche and Apache, as if those names automatically meant the same enemies in every decade. The Southern Plains did not have fixed teams. It had shifting coalitions, old grudges, new opportunities, and constant negotiation. There were periods of intense conflict, and there were periods when other concerns, Spain's trade fairs, New Mexico's markets, drought, disease, the pull of Mexico's interior, reshaped priorities. Still, the broad movement is hard to miss. By the late 1700s, the Comanche were not just a raiding people passing through, they were a central power shaping where other peoples could live and how they could move. That changed the borderlands in ways Spanish officials only partly understood. It also created a new kind of frontier problem for whoever inherited Spain's northern provinces. Because now the question was not simply, how do you defend San Antonio, or how do you supply a presidio? It was, what do you do when the most important roads are not roads at all? The important routes were the river crossings, the breaks in the escarpments, the water holes that made travel possible, the long corridors where horse herds could be pushed without dying, the channels through which stolen stock moved south, and manufactured goods moved north. Whoever controlled those corridors did not just raid empires, they regulated the entire economy of the plains. And that is where the balance begins to tilt. When Spain learned to bargain with Comancheria, it did so in a world where Comanche power had already altered the map for other native peoples. The southern plains were becoming a Comanche-centered system, and that meant Spain's successor states would inherit more than a border problem. Mexico and, later, Texas would inherit a plains where the strongest force was not a fort, not a capital, not a treaty office. It was a network of horse herds, hunting grounds, and routes, held together by speed, knowledge, and the simple fact that on that grassland, the people who could move fastest could decide when the frontier existed at all. Spain's northern frontier had always been thin, but it had structure. It had presidios, mission towns, governors who, at least on paper, could order men and supplies from one place to another. It had a diplomatic vocabulary that, however imperfectly, recognized that peace on the plains was something you negotiated, not something you simply enforced. Then, in 1821, New Spain became Mexico, and in the north, independence did not arrive like a flag being raised over a quiet plaza. It arrived as a long political transition that broke old supply lines and scattered old authority. The provinces that mattered most here were far from Mexico City: Texas, Coahuila, Nuevo León, Chihuahua, Nuevo Mexico. Places tied together not by roads but by distance, by deserts and mountains and grasslands. And in those first decades after independence, northern Mexico faced a basic problem that sounds simple until you try to solve it. It could not afford its own frontier. Garrisons went unpaid. Presidios that had once been barely adequate became hollow. Some soldiers deserted. Some posts became local fiefdoms where a commander did whatever he could to keep men fed. State governments and the national government argued over who had the right to raise troops and who had to pay for them. Governors changed. Plans changed. And while politicians debated federalism versus centralism, whether Mexico would be a republic of strong states or a centralized nation, the frontier kept operating by its own rules. Those rules favored the people who did not need payrolls. Comanche bands did not have to wait for orders. They did not have to haul cannon. They did not have to protect a fixed line. Their strength was a moving system: horse herds on good grass, scouts on the rivers, a memory of every reliable spring from the Canadian River down toward the Balcones escarpment, and a trade network that could turn stolen animals into guns, powder, and manufactured goods. That is the part that often gets missed when we talk about raids. Raiding was violence, yes. Horse stealing, captive taking, livestock drives, revenge. But it was also pressure applied to an economy. Northern Mexico was full of horses and mules. Mining districts needed them. Ranches bred them. Transport depended on them. And when a Comanche war party could sweep in, take 100 animals, and vanish back into the grasslands, it did not just hurt a single family. It disrupted commerce. It raised the cost of travel. It emptied remote ranchos. It made whole corridors unsafe. Mexican officials could see the pattern. They wrote reports about it constantly. They described raids into Coahuila and Chihuahua, into Nuevo León, sometimes deep enough that it felt like no one was beyond reach. They also described the impossible geometry of pursuing mounted fighters into a world with few roads and fewer supplies. You could send a column out from Saltillo or Chihuahua City, but the column needed water, and the Comanche could choose the time and place where water stopped existing. And meanwhile, Mexico's own frontier populations were changing. After 1821, Mexico encouraged immigration to Texas as a buffer against both native raiding and foreign invasion. The most famous version of that policy was the empresario system, contracts that brought Anglo-American settlers into Mexican Texas in the 1820s. Stephen F. Austin's colony was the beginning, not the whole story. Tejanos were already there. Mexican soldiers were there. Indigenous peoples were there. But the demographic balance began to tilt, and it tilted fast. Those new settlements did not land on an empty map. They landed in a borderland already shaped by Comancheria, by the old raiding corridors, by the trading routes, by the seasonal movement of buffalo and horses, and by the established fact that a ranch outside a protected town was, in many years, an exposed target. For settlers along the Brazos, the Colorado, the Guadalupe, the San Antonio River system, danger was not an abstraction. A horse herd was your mobility, your farm power, your wealth, your status. Lose the horses and you were not just poorer, you were stranded. A raid could also mean captives, men killed in the fighting, women and children taken, sometimes held for adoption, sometimes for exchange, sometimes sold through networks that reached into New Mexico and beyond. The captive economy was not a side effect. It was woven into the borderlands, and every community, Mexican, Tejano, Anglo, feared it for reasons that were both personal and political. This is where the Texas frontier begins to intensify the entire system. Because Anglo-American settlement did something Spain and Mexico struggled to do, it put more fixed property on the edge, more farms, more fenced fields, more stock, more isolated families. In other words, it created more targets, and it narrowed the space for diplomacy at the same time. Comanche bands could raid those settlements and retreat north into the plains. They could also raid Mexican ranches and towns to the south and west, and they could play those frontiers against each other because the borderlands were divided not only by language but by authority. A Mexican state commander in Coahuila could not order men in Texas the way a Spanish governor once might have tried. A local militia captain could refuse to march. A Texas settlement could beg for help and get none. And even when men did ride, pursuit required horses. And horses were the very thing being taken. Distance mattered in another way. The capitals were far away from the blood and theft and fear. Mexico City was a world apart. Even Saltillo and Monterrey could feel distant from an outlying ranch on the Nueces. Orders took time, news took time, and by the time a response formed, the Comanche were already gone. Back across the Red River, back beyond the Llano Estacado, back into a country where a pursuing force had to solve the problem of water all over again. So local violence became tied to larger political transitions. Mexico's struggle to define itself after 1821, its changes of constitution, its internal revolts, its financial crises, was not separate from what happened on the frontier. It was part of the same chain. Weak state capacity on the periphery meant raiding was harder to stop. Raiding made the periphery feel ungovernable. That perception fed political radicalization in the settlements, and that radicalization, in turn, pushed Texas toward its break with Mexico. By the early 1830s, the arguments inside Mexican Texas were no longer only about trade and tariffs and local governance. They were also about security. Who was supposed to protect a family on the Colorado River? Who would recover stolen horses? Who would negotiate with the Comanche? And on what terms? Mexican officials could promise treaties. Settlers demanded results. Tejano communities, caught between national politics and frontier reality, had their own calculations, their own fears, their own reasons to resist being abandoned. And out on the plains, Comancheria watched all of it like a weather system watches a fence line, not with one unified plan, not as a single mind, but as bands making decisions that made sense to them, where the herds were, where the enemies were, where the goods were, where the risk was lowest. This is the moment when two different ideas of frontier begin to collide. For Mexico, the frontier was a distant edge to be managed, ideally through a mix of diplomacy, trade, and occasional force. For many incoming Texans, the frontier became a line to be pushed outward, a line that would be defended by volunteers, militias, and soon, something else. Because Texas is about to become its own republic, and inside that republic, leaders will argue about what the Comanche problem even is. Is it a military problem? A diplomatic problem? A trade problem? A hostage problem? A problem of borders and settlement policy? Those arguments will have names attached to them. Sam Houston, Mirabeau Lamar, and they will shape everything that follows. But they begin here, in the hard truth Mexico learned first. On the southern plains, the side that could move fastest could decide when the frontier existed at all. The Republic of Texas was born into a borderland that did not care about proclamations. In 1836, there was a new flag, a new government, and a capital that moved like a camp. But the frontier stayed where it had always been, along the rivers and the timberlines, along the edge of dependable water, along the places where horse herds could graze, and where a small settlement could be found by a scouting party in half a day. And almost immediately Texas began arguing with itself about what kind of country it thought it was. Sam Houston, the first president of the Republic, had lived among the Cherokee. He had learned, imperfectly, but personally, that native nations were political entities with their own interests and their own internal debates. Houston's instinct was to treat the Comanche and other tribes as sovereign powers on the frontier, not simply as obstacles. That meant councils. It meant gifts and trade. It meant treaties that tried to make boundaries legible, even when the land itself refused to be bounded. It meant, in Houston's mind, that stability could be bought cheaper than it could be conquered. Mirabeau B. Lamar, who followed Houston into office in 1838, did not share that premise. Lamar's view was more common among expansion-minded settlers. Texas would not be secure until it had room to grow without negotiating for every mile. Where Houston saw diplomacy as a tool for survival, Lamar saw it as an admission that the republic was weak. Where Houston was willing to recognize native sovereignty in practice, Lamar leaned toward removal, punishment, and the attempt to force a final settlement by force of arms. This wasn't only a personality clash. It was a clash of assumptions. If you believed the Comanche were a nation, or rather, a set of nations and bands that could be dealt with through recognized leaders, then you could imagine a treaty holding, at least for a time, if you could keep your own people from breaking it. But if you believed the Comanche were simply raiders, and that raiding was their permanent nature, then any peace was just a pause before the next attack, and the only rational answer was to drive them away. Both theories had a problem. The problem was the ground. Texas could not turn diplomacy into control because it could not make its promises real on the frontier. A treaty might be signed in a town, with interpreters and handshakes and paper. But out on the Guadalupe or the Colorado, a family building a cabin did not feel protected by paper. Rangers and militia companies were too few, underpaid, sometimes undisciplined, often reactive. And settlers kept coming. They pushed beyond whatever line had been discussed at the last council. They cut timber where someone else had hunted. They grazed cattle on river bottoms that had been horse pasture. They treated public land as if it were empty land, and on the southern plains that assumption was the seed of endless conflict. But Texas also could not turn force into control, because the republic was not built for sustained war on the plains. A punitive expedition could ride out, burn a village that had already moved, kill a few men who might not even belong to the band that had raided last month, and ride home calling it victory. Meanwhile, Comanche horse herds multiplied. Comanche scouts watched the roads. War parties chose the time and place. And when Texans marched deep, they met the same old geometry Spain and Mexico had met: distance, water, grass, and an enemy who did not need a supply train to survive. The Lamar administration tried to make violence do what diplomacy had failed to do. It encouraged more aggressive ranger operations. It leaned into retaliatory campaigns. It also pursued a hard line toward other native peoples inside Texas, especially the Cherokee and their allied communities in East Texas, pushing a removal policy that culminated in fighting in 1839. That mattered on the Comanche frontier because it sent a message about what Texas meant by peace. It suggested that agreements could be reversed when politics changed, and that settlement would keep advancing no matter what was said in council. And then there was the other reality, the one no president could fully command. The republic did not speak with one voice. Houston might want a treaty, Lamar might want a campaign, but a local militia captain might want revenge for a stolen herd. A ranger company might take captives to exchange or to punish. A trading post might sell ammunition to one side today and the other side tomorrow. A county judge might issue land titles into contested territory because settlers were demanding them, and because the republic's finances depended on selling land. Each decision made sense in isolation. Together they produced chaos. For the Comanche, this meant that Texas was not a single actor either. It was a shifting collection of towns, farms, ranger camps, and political factions. A peace talk with one set of officials did not guarantee safety from another group riding out of a different county. And because Comanche society was organized in bands, not in a centralized state, the same problem existed on their side. One band might be willing to talk. Another might be raiding the same week, for horses, for captives, for vengeance, for status, for survival. Even a sincere agreement could be broken without anyone deciding, in some formal way, to break it. So the Republic drifted into the worst possible middle ground: too much negotiation to mobilize fully for war, and too much violence to make negotiation credible. This is the gap between government intention and frontier life. In Austin, men could imagine a map that held still. On the plains, nothing held still. The buffalo moved, the grass changed, the rivers rose and fell. A Comanche band could be on the San Saba 1 month, and beyond the Red River the next. A Texan settlement that looked like an outpost of a future state could become, in one bad season, an abandoned cluster of chimneys, and the pressure kept building because the stakes were not abstract. Every raid was a test of sovereignty. When a war party drove off a herd, it wasn't only theft, it was a statement that Texas could not protect property. When settlers pushed a new line of cabins up a river valley, it wasn't only migration. It was a statement that Comancheria's hunting and grazing space could be taken and held. By late 1839 and into 1840, both sides were approaching a conclusion without saying it out loud. Diplomacy required trust and enforcement, and Texas had neither. Force required money, logistics, and time, and Texas did not have enough of any of them. What remained was the oldest frontier logic: hostages, captives, retaliations, and the attempt to settle questions with a single dramatic act. And in the spring of 1840, Texas officials would invite Comanche leaders into San Antonio to talk about peace and captives. It would sound on paper like the return of negotiation, but underneath it was the unresolved pressure of two incompatible futures, and that pressure was about to break. The meeting was scheduled for San Antonio in March of 1840, inside a stone building that Texans called the Council House. The stated purpose was simple: talk peace, settle terms, and most urgently, return captives. For Texan families on the frontier, the captive question was not a policy issue, it was a wound that never closed. For Comanche bands, captives were also not a single thing. Some were ransom, some were adoption, some were labor, and some were leverage. In a world where leverage was survival, Texas officials, under Lamar's administration, came into the council expecting a clean exchange. Bring in the captives, receive gifts, negotiate boundaries. In their minds, this was how you proved good faith. The Comanche delegation that rode in, largely Pennatica leaders, came with a different expectation. They brought one captive, a young girl, and they indicated that other captives were held elsewhere, in other camps, by other bands. That was not a dodge in the way Texans heard it. It was the political reality of Comancheria. A leader could speak, a leader could persuade, but he could not simply command every band, every household, every captive taken on a different raid with different obligations attached to it. Inside the council house, that mismatch became fatal. The Texan side had decided, ahead of time, that if the Comanche did not produce all captives at once, the delegates would be held as hostages until they did. It was meant to be pressure. It was meant to force the machinery of Comanche politics into a shape Texans could recognize. But from a Comanche perspective, it turned the council into a trap. Councils were supposed to be protected space. If men could be seized under a flag of negotiation, then negotiation itself became a weapon. Accounts differ in detail, and they differ in emphasis, but the core outcome is not in dispute. A struggle broke out. Gunfire erupted inside and around the council house. Several Comanche leaders were killed. Others attempted to fight their way out and were killed in the streets. Some women and children who had accompanied the delegation were taken prisoner. Texans suffered casualties too, but what mattered most was not the tally. What mattered was that the one place both sides were supposed to be able to speak without being hunted had been turned into a killing ground. After Council House, there was no neutral language left. If you are looking for the moment when negotiations shattered into something like permanent distrust, this is the moment historians return to. Not because there had been peace before, there had not, but because after this, the idea of peace talks carried the memory of San Antonio. The Comanche learned that entering a Texan town under promises could end in death and captivity. Texans learned something else, that even a council might not deliver what they wanted, and that the frontier's most painful demands could not be satisfied by a handshake. And then came the logic that always follows a broken council: retaliation. In Comanche politics, as on the Texan frontier, violence was not just violence, it was communication. It was a way of announcing that a line had been crossed and that the cost would be collected. And because Comancheria was a horse empire, the collection could be swift and wide. In the summer of 1840, war parties rode south and east in what Texans would remember as the Great Raid. It was one of the largest Comanche raids ever to strike deep into Texas. Not a single skirmish, but a moving front of mounted power. The raiders swept through settlements and ranches, taking horses and mules by the hundreds, driving herds the way Comanche had driven Spanish stock for generations. There were killings. There were captives. There was the deliberate stripping of a region's mobility, because on the frontier, taking horses was not just stealing wealth. It was taking the enemy's ability to respond. The raid pushed all the way to the Gulf Coast, to the small port settlement of Linville on Matagorda Bay. Linville was not a fortress. It was a warehouse town, a place where goods arrived by ship and moved inland. Cloth, tools, ammunition, the manufactured edge of an industrial world pressing into a grassland world. The Comanche struck it and plundered it, and for Texans the psychological effect was immense. This was not a raid on a lonely cabin. This was a raid that reached saltwater. It suggested that no place in Texas was truly behind the lines, because Texas did not really have lines. The response came fast, but it came the way Texas almost always responded in 1840, as an improvised pursuit. Rangers, militia, and volunteers gathered, including men from Gonzales and other hard frontier communities, and they caught up with the returning war parties as they moved back inland with their captured horses and goods. The most famous fight came near Plum Creek, not far from present-day Lockhart, in August of 1840. It is often described as a battle, but it was closer to what the frontier produced again and again: a running engagement, a series of clashes along a creek bottom and open prairie as mounted Texans pressed an attack on a moving column. What Plum Creek revealed was not a clean victory for either side. It revealed capability. The Texans could concentrate men quickly when the alarm was loud enough. They could hit hard when they caught a raiding party burdened with loot and herds. They could recover some property. They could inflict losses. But it also revealed the deeper problem. The Comanche had already done what they came to do. They had demonstrated reach. They had demonstrated that the Republic of Texas could be struck across a huge span of territory, from the inner frontier to the coast, and that the response would almost always be after the fact, chasing a shadow that was already riding away. So the question hangs here, unanswered and uncomfortable. After Council House and the Great Raid, did Texas have any realistic way to control this conflict on its own? A small republic with little cash, long distances, and a thin population trying to defend scattered settlements against an enemy whose wealth was measured in horses and whose map was made of rivers, springs, and grass. Texas could retaliate. It could harden. It could send rangers and volunteers into the brush and the plains. But control is something else. Control means preventing the next raid before it forms. Control means making promises on the frontier that are actually enforceable. And in 1840, after San Antonio, with trust broken and the captive question still burning, Texas was about to learn how expensive control really was and how far beyond its reach it might be. And then, 5 years after the Council House bloodshed and the Great Raid, the map changed on paper. In 1845, Texas joined the United States. Annexation is often described like a switch flipping, republic to state, Texan problem to American problem. But on the southern plains, nothing flipped cleanly. What changed was scale. The pressure that had been intermittent and improvised under the Republic began to grow into something larger, more regular, and more difficult for Comanche bands to simply ride around. The Republic of Texas had fought with volunteers, short enlistments, fragile supply lines, and a treasury that was almost always empty. Rangers could strike hard, but they could not hold much ground for long. The Republic could build a fort, but it could not fill the spaces between forts with people and roads and patrols. Comancheria had been designed by history to exploit exactly that weakness. Distance was armor, speed was weapon, and a thin enemy could be bled without being met in a single decisive place. The United States did not instantly solve those problems. It inherited them, but the United States could do something the Republic rarely could. It could sustain effort. It could fund garrisons. It could replace losses. It could keep men in the field for years. And it could do it while settlers, many of them arriving with the confidence of federal backing, pushed into the same river valleys and grasslands the Comanche had long treated as their operating space. This is where the tightening began to feel different. Forts multiplied, not as lone outposts but as a chain. Soldiers and contractors cut roads between them. Wagon ruts became routes, and routes became habits, and habits became claims. A fort was not just a cluster of buildings, it was a market. It was a demand for hay and wood and beef. It was a place where horse traders came looking for animals, where merchants moved cloth, kettles, powder, lead, and every one of those goods had to travel through country the Comanche knew intimately. Commercial intrusion did not arrive with a single signature. It arrived as wagons. The problem for Comanche leadership was that wagons were not just targets. Wagons were also proof. They were evidence of something permanent. A raid could punish a settlement, recover captives, take horses, burn a building. But the next year the settlement might return, larger. And now, after annexation, the return was backed by a federal system that could send soldiers and also send surveyors, men with rifles and men with chains, men who wrote down the land in a new language of sections and deeds. This was not yet the later era of railroads cutting straight lines across but it was the beginning of a different geometry. Roads and forts and mail routes started to narrow the number of safe corridors between water and grass. On the plains, that is what control looks like. Not a flag on a hill, control of springs, control of crossings, control of the places where 1,000 horses can drink. And yet, here is the part that people often misunderstand. Annexation did not mean that the United States replaced conflict with a clean, managed system of peace. Reservation pressure emerged alongside war, not instead of it. In Washington, a set of ideas had been hardening for decades, that native nations could be moved, concentrated, supervised, and transformed by treaty and ration and agency. But on the ground in Texas and the Indian Territory, those ideas collided with older realities. The Comanche were not a small, cornered people in 1845. They were still a horse empire. They could still raise large war parties. They could still strike deep into Mexico and return with remudas of stolen horses, captives, and trade goods. They could still make the frontier feel like a place where a family might wake up and find their entire mobility gone. So the federal government tried multiple tools at once. More soldiers, more forts, more treaties, more promises of annuities, more talk of settling bands near agencies. But the same contradictions stayed in place. An American officer might believe he was negotiating with the Comanche, as if there was one council that could bind everyone. A Comanche leader might make commitments that applied to his band, his relatives, the people who listened to him, while other bands, facing different pressures and different opportunities, continued raiding because raiding was how you replaced horses, how you paid debts, how you proved strength, how you fed and protected families in an economy that outsiders were actively disrupting. And the federal capacity, for all its size, had limits that were not just logistical, they were political. The U.S. Army after the Mexican-American War had new territory to garrison and a long border to patrol. Units were scattered, commanders rotated, policies changed with administrations. One year an agent might urge restraint and gifts. The next year a new commander might demand punishment in campaigns. The Comanche, watching this, learned what they had already learned with Spain and Mexico, that the enemy did not always speak with one voice, and that inconsistency could be used. But even inconsistency looks different when it rides behind a larger population. Settlers were not simply an extension of the army. They were their own force. A cabin on a creek became a vote. A county became tax revenue. A town became a petition for protection. And protection, in practice, meant pushing the zone of safe settlement outward into hunting grounds, into horse pastures, into the spaces where Comanche families moved with the seasons. Every new fence line was a small act of enclosure in a world that had functioned by mobility. For the Comanche, the question after annexation was not just, can we win battles? It was, can we preserve the conditions that make our way of life possible? Because a horse empire does not collapse only when warriors fall. It collapses when grass is taken, when water is controlled, when trade routes are choked, when buffalo range is disturbed, when the distances that once protected you are filled with people. By the 1850s and into the 1860s, the pressure would keep building, sometimes easing during national crises, sometimes snapping tight again. And inside Comancheria, different answers formed. Some leaders looked for a way to negotiate survival in a tightening ring. Others committed to staying out beyond the edge of forts and towns, refusing the agency system and the ration economy that came with it. It is here, in this narrowing space between an expanding United States and a plains empire built on speed, that one band begins to matter more and more. The Quahati, the antelope eaters, a people who kept to the harder country, who resisted settlement and accommodation longer than most, and who would produce a leader shaped by both worlds that were colliding. Because the final era of Comanche resistance is not just about the army getting stronger, it is about a new kind of pressure, military, economic, demographic, closing from every direction at once. And it is about the leaders who tried to read that pressure and decide what could still be saved. And one name in that last tightening circle will not go away: Quanah Parker. Quanah Parker is often introduced like a legend, and there are reasons for that. But he did not rise out of myth. He rose out of a particular band, in a particular landscape. In the last years when a Comanche life outside the agency system was still possible, he was the son of Cynthia Ann Parker and Peta Nocona, a Comanche leader often associated in the sources with the Noconi, though even here the record is not as clean as later retellings pretend. Cynthia Ann, taken as a child in 1836 during the raid on Fort Parker, became Comanche in the deepest way the plains allowed, by language, family, and time. When Texas forces rescued her in 1860 at Pease River, she was pulled back across a boundary she did not recognize as home anymore. She was separated from her Comanche children. One of them was Quanah. He grew up with the story of that separation as a wound that never closed, and as a lesson about how quickly the outside world could reach into a camp and take away the people who mattered. To understand why Quanah mattered, you have to understand the Quahati. The Comanche were not a single centralized nation issuing orders from one council fire. They were a world of bands, related, trading, marrying, fighting together, splitting apart, recombining. A man might be Comanche to outsiders and still identify first with the people he rode with, the relatives who moved their lodges near his, the leaders whose judgment he trusted. The Quahati, the antelope eaters, were one of those bands, and they were known, even among other Comanches, for staying out. Out in this case was not an attitude, it was geography. The Quahati kept to the harder country along the Llano Estacado and the high plains of the Texas Panhandle and eastern New Mexico, moving through river breaks and caprock edges where water was precious and distances were long. That country protected a people who understood it. It punished soldiers who did not, and it allowed the Quahati to do what a horse people needed to do to stay free: keep large horse herds safe, keep buffalo within reach, and keep the routes open, north to the other plains peoples, west toward New Mexico, south toward the trading and raiding roads that led into Mexico. For years, that outness made the Quahati difficult for American officials to deal with. Treaties could be signed with leaders who came in to talk. Agencies could offer rations to bands willing to camp nearby, but the Quahati were more likely to be absent when the pens were built and the annuity goods arrived. They did not disappear. They simply stayed in the spaces the United States had not yet learned how to hold. Quanah became prominent in that context, not because he was born with a title, but because the world was selecting for a particular kind of leader. In the old days of wide Comancheria, leadership could be distributed. A good war chief drew men for a raid and then went back to being one man among many. A respected older man guided decisions by persuasion, not by command. But as the ring tightened, more forts, more patrols, more settlers, more retaliation. The cost of a mistake rose. Bands that stayed out needed leaders who could read the enemy and read their own people. Who could keep families moving without breaking them? Who could coordinate defense and raids and flight without turning Comanche life into a permanent stampede? Quanah's mixed heritage has been overexplained by some writers, as if being the child of a white captive automatically made him a bridge. It was not that simple. What mattered was that he understood, early and intimately, the consequences of being known. Cynthia Ann had been known, found, taken. The lesson for a Quahati leader was not romance, it was operational security. It was movement. It was keeping the camps out of reach of scouts and informants and chance meetings at water. And at the same time, the widening trade world was forcing knowledge into everyone's hands. The Comanche had always adapted: Spanish steel, Mexican saddles, American guns, new kinds of ammunition, new markets for horses. By the 1860s and early 1870s, the adaptation problem had sharpened. Firearms were improving. The numbers of mounted enemies were increasing. Buffalo runners and hide hunters were beginning to enter the southern herd's range in greater numbers. The old Comanche answer to shortage, raid for horses, raid for captives, raid for goods, still worked in the short term, but each raid now pulled more pursuit behind it, and each pursuit carried better weapons and a longer reach. This is where Quanah's story stays connected to the larger Comanche story, instead of floating away into biography. He represented one of the last successful attempts to keep independent Comanche life functioning under conditions it had not been designed for. To keep the herds together, to keep families fed, to keep the band moving through a landscape where the best water and grass were becoming predictable points of interception. To keep young men committed to a strategy that demanded patience, not just courage. And there was another pressure, quieter but relentless, pressing behind the soldiers. The reservation system was not just a line on a map. It was a new economy. It offered food in exchange for proximity. It offered protection in exchange for supervision. It offered peace in exchange for dependence. Some Comanche leaders saw it as a temporary shelter, a place to regroup. Others saw it as a trap that would turn a horse people into a ration line. The Quahati, more than most, resisted that exchange. They had stayed out long enough to believe the outside world might eventually tire, might turn elsewhere, might leave the high plains alone. But by the early 1870s, the question was becoming unavoidable. Not, who is the strongest war chief, but what happens when the buffalo are no longer where they have always been, and when the forts and roads begin to control the water? Quanah Parker's rise is the sign that the old Comanche world understood the danger and tried to answer it with leadership. The next chapters are where we see whether leadership was enough, because the crisis coming for the Quahati was bigger than any one man. It was a collision between a mobile empire and a system designed to make mobility impossible. In 1867, the United States tried to solve what it called the Comanche problem with a piece of paper and a line on a map. That autumn, on Medicine Lodge Creek in southern Kansas, federal commissioners met with Comanche, Kiowa, and Kiowa Apache leaders in one of the largest treaty councils ever held on the plains. The agreements that came out of it, usually grouped together as the Treaty of Medicine Lodge Creek, promised a kind of bargain the government had begun, offering everywhere west of the Mississippi peace, protection, and supplies in exchange for moving onto a defined reservation and accepting an agency system that would supervise the future. For the Comanche and their close allies, that future was supposed to be in Indian Territory, in what is now southwestern Oklahoma. The reservation boundaries, as written, included the Wichita Mountains and the grass country along the Washita River, with agency buildings, ration distribution, and the expectation that bands would stay put. The United States would build roads and forts around the perimeter. It would assign agents. It would issue annuities, food, tools, cloth, on schedules decided far away. And it would demand a promise that raids would stop, that captives would be returned, and that the southern plains would become safe for American expansion. On paper, it sounds like a clean exchange. In practice, it was a collision between a mobile economy and a system built to end mobility. The reservation was not simply smaller than Comancheria. It was different in kind. The Comanche world had been designed around movement, following buffalo and grass, protecting horse herds, shifting camps to avoid sickness and enemies, maintaining trade routes that ran like invisible roads from the Arkansas to the Rio Grande. A boundary line could not tell you where the best grazing would be after a drought. It could not tell you where the buffalo would drift in a hard winter, and it could not tell you how to keep thousands of horses alive in a country where overgrazing could ruin a band in a single season. So even after Medicine Lodge, many Comanches did what they had always done when survival required it. They left. Some bands came into the agencies, took rations, listened to speeches, tried to read the new rules and see if there was a way to live with them. Others stayed out almost entirely, especially the Quahati, who remained in the broken country of the Llano Estacado and the Panhandle, where soldiers had difficulty supplying themselves and where a camp could disappear into distance. And even among those who did sign, the meaning of a signature was not always what federal officials thought it was. On the plains, agreements were often understood as relationships, conditional, reciprocal, maintained by ongoing good faith. In Washington, a treaty was a permanent transfer of control, enforced by force if necessary. The same words sat on the same page, and the two sides heard different futures inside them. The United States also built the treaty on assumptions that were at best optimistic. It assumed agents could reliably distribute food and goods in a region where corruption was common and supply lines were long. It assumed the Army could keep settlers and hunters from trespassing on reservation land. It assumed that if you placed a horse people near an agency, they would gradually become farmers, as if culture was only a matter of instruction and equipment. And it assumed that a people whose power had been built on buffalo, horses, trade, and raiding could simply step out of that system without starving. But the plains did not negotiate. When rations failed to arrive, or arrived spoiled, or arrived in amounts that could not feed a camp, families did not have the luxury of waiting for paperwork to catch up. When grass ran short around the agency, horse herds had to be moved or they would die. When buffalo were reported south on the staked plains, hunters followed them because that was meat and hides and marrow and the one food system that had never required an agent's permission. And then there was the human reality inside the policy. A young man who had grown up proving himself in the old way did not easily accept a world where his status depended on standing in line. A leader who had held influence through generosity and success in war did not automatically become an Indian chief in the agency sense, someone who could order compliance and expect obedience. Comanche politics, like their economy, had been built on consent and choice. The reservation system demanded something closer to centralized control because it needed one signature to bind everyone, one man to hold responsible, one tribe that could be managed as a unit. That was not how Comanche life worked, and it meant the government was constantly surprised when the Comanches did not act like a single body. From the outside, this looked like simple treaty breaking. From inside Comanche life, it often looked like a boundary that could not feed you. So the years after Medicine Lodge became a strange, unstable middle ground. Some bands tried the agencies and then drifted back out. Some moved in for winter rations and left again when the grass returned. Raiders struck settlements in Texas and Kansas, and federal officials insisted the responsible leaders come in and be punished as if a signed paper had created a police force that did not exist. Soldiers rode out to bring in bands who had never truly been in, and every cycle of raid and retaliation hardened the belief, on both sides, that the other side was acting in bad faith. The pressure was rising, but the decisive thing had not happened yet, because as long as the buffalo still held on, so long as there were still vast, moving herds on the southern plains, Comanche independence had a fuel source the reservation could not replace. It meant a band could leave the agency and live. It meant the Quahati strategy of staying out was still economically possible. It meant war was still, in a grim way, sustainable, and that is the trap hidden inside the Medicine Lodge years. They look like a pause, like diplomacy, like an attempt at order. But they were also the last moment when a paper system could pretend it was stronger than ecology, when the federal government could believe boundaries would do the work, when the Comanche could believe distance and movement would still be enough. The next pressure point was not a new treaty. It was a collapse. When the buffalo began to vanish from the southern plains, the argument about boundaries stopped being theoretical. It became a question of whether a people could stay alive at all, and what they would do. When the last great resource that made noncompliance possible was deliberately hunted down, the buffalo collapse did not happen in a single dramatic moment. It happened the way ecosystems often die, in pieces. In winters when the herds did not return where they were expected. In summers when hunters rode farther and came back with less. in the growing sound of rifle shots in places that had once been quiet except for wind and hooves. By the early 1870s, commercial hide hunting had moved onto the southern plains with industrial force. The new rail lines to the north and east turned hides into cash and ammunition into certainty. Breech-loading rifles, especially the big 50 caliber buffalo guns, made it possible for a small number of men to kill a large number of animals quickly and to do it at distances that made any counterattack dangerous. Some hunters killed for hides and left the meat. Others killed because they believed, openly, that removing the buffalo would remove the last independence of the Plains tribes. The motives varied, the effect did not. For the Comanche world, buffalo were not just food, they were the material foundation of mobility. Hides became lodges and robes, sinew became cordage, meat became winter, surplus became trade. A band that could follow buffalo could stay out of reach of an agent and a ration schedule. A band that could not find buffalo had to make a different choice, and the choices were narrowing. And then, in the spring and early summer of 1874, that pressure snapped into violence at a place that looked, on a map, like almost nothing: Adobe Walls. Adobe Walls was a small cluster of buildings in the Texas Panhandle, trading posts and hunting camps near the Canadian river breaks. To hide hunters, it was a base. To Comanches and their allies, it was something else. A symbol of intrusion and a practical threat. A place where the buffalo were being cut down within reach of their hunting grounds. In late June of 1874, a large force of warriors, Comanche, Kiowa, Southern Cheyenne, and Arapaho, struck the complex in what became known as the Second Battle of Adobe Walls. The attack was fierce, coordinated, and meant to drive the hunters out. But the buildings, thick-walled and defensive by accident, became a fort. The hunters and their allies had repeating rifles and long-range guns, and they could shoot from cover. The fighting lasted 2 days. The attackers withdrew. Later tellings would fixate on one famous long-distance shot that reportedly killed a warrior at extreme range, a moment that became legend in the hide-hunting world. But the larger meaning was simpler and colder. At Adobe Walls, the old solution, ride in fast, overwhelm a small outpost, take horses and supplies and vanish, ran into a new reality. Men who could sit behind cover and pour out accurate fire, supplied by a market economy that could replace them if they died. Adobe Walls did not end the war. It began the last phase of it. The United States Army responded with what it had been learning to do across the West. Not a single chase, but a system. In the months that followed, the Army launched the Red River War, a campaign designed to squeeze the last free bands out of the southern plains and onto the reservations in Indian Territory. The geography mattered. The Red River country, the Panhandle, the broken canyons, and the wide flat distances of the Llano Estacado. This was a place where a band that knew water and grass could disappear. The Army's answer was to move in converging columns, multiple forces marching from different directions, trying to deny escape routes, strike camps, and keep pressure constant. It was not only Comanche bands being targeted. Kiowa, Southern Cheyenne, and Arapaho groups were in the same storm, each with their own reasons for resisting and their own internal divisions over whether to come in. The Army treated the resistance as a single problem with a single solution: find the camps, break their ability to move, destroy the means to live through winter, force surrender. In September of 1874, Colonel Ranald S. Mackenzie brought that logic into the heart of the Texas Panhandle. Mackenzie had already built a reputation as a hard, effective commander. He did not romanticize what he was doing, and he did not rely on a single set-piece battle. His method was the method the Army was increasingly adopting: strike the logistics of a mobile people. At Palo Duro Canyon, a deep cut in the plains south of the Canadian River, Mackenzie's men found what the Army had been trying to find all along: winter camps and the stored wealth of survival. Lodges, food, equipment, and, most importantly, horses. The destruction there became one of the decisive acts of the Plains War. Soldiers burned supplies and stores that could not be easily replaced. They destroyed lodges that sheltered families, and they captured an enormous number of horses, thousands by many accounts. then slaughtered a large portion of them because the army could not feed them and did not want them recaptured. It is hard to overstate what that meant in the Comanche system. A Comanche band without horses was not merely poorer. It was pinned in place. Horses were hunting, because buffalo could not be taken efficiently without speed and reach. Horses were warfare, because raids depended on surprise, distance, and the ability to withdraw. Horses were trade, because horseflesh was currency across the plains and into New Mexico and Mexico. Horses were status, because wealth and generosity were measured in animals you could give away. And horses were winter, because mobility was what let you move to grass, move away from sickness, move toward game, move away from soldiers. To lose the horse herd was to lose the ability to choose. After Palo Duro, the Red River War continued through the fall and winter. Running fights, smaller engagements, relentless pursuit. The army kept closing the distances, and the ecological floor kept dropping away. With buffalo herds collapsing, with horse herds captured or destroyed, with winter coming, and with disease and hunger always waiting at the edge of a weakened camp, the logic of staying out began to fail even for the bands who had resisted longest. By 1875, the combined weight of forces, war, military pressure, settler expansion, reservation policy, and the deliberate destruction of the buffalo had broken the remaining free power of the Comanche on the plains. Not because Comanche knowledge had vanished, not because courage had vanished, but because the material engine of independence had been dismantled piece by piece until there was nothing left to run it. The question was no longer whether the United States could stop them in open country. The question became what survival would look like after the horse empire was forced into a new kind of world. For many Americans, the story ends right there. 1875, Fort Sill, surrender papers, a line in a textbook that sounds like a door closing. But empires do not only fall in battles. Sometimes they are dismantled the way a machine is dismantled, one piece at a time. The horse herds reduced, the buffalo gone, the trade routes cut, the old distances patrolled by soldiers and fenced by settlers. The Comanche horse empire was not defeated in a single clean moment. It was taken apart until it could no longer run. And what followed was not an ending, it was a forced transformation. Reservation life in Indian Territory, what is now Oklahoma, did not simply settle the Comanche into peace. It reorganized time itself. Rations replaced the seasonal round. Agency schedules replaced the logic of grass and water. Mobility, the great advantage of Comancheria, was treated as a problem to be solved, and the new world came with new pressures. Hunger when rations failed, sickness in crowded conditions, the steady pull of policies meant to break up communal land and push people into individual allotments. Even names changed in the paperwork. Bands that had once been defined by kinship, consent, and a leader's ability to persuade were now filtered through government categories. The old economy, horses, buffalo products, raiding, and long trade, was pushed aside by wage labor and dependence, not because Comanches forgot how to live on the plains, but because the plains world they had mastered was being made unlivable. And still, the Comanche did not disappear. They adapted, the way plains peoples had always adapted. They rebuilt families after loss. They carried language, stories, and social obligations into a place designed to flatten them. They found new ways to be Comanche, in a world where the horse was no longer the center of power but was still remembered as knowledge, how to move, how to read country, how to organize a band, how to endure. This matters, because the most common mistake in telling plains history is to make conquest sound like erasure. It was not. The Comanche nation survived. It continues today, centered in Oklahoma, with communities, governments, elders, and young people who are not relics of the 19th century, but citizens of the present. So when we ask the question we began with, how the Comanche built a horse empire before Texas could stop them, we end up with a harder question underneath it. What, exactly, made Comanche power so formidable for so long? Was it the horse alone? Or was it the ability to turn horses into an entire system? Economy, warfare, diplomacy, family mobility, and a deep, practical reading of the Southern Plains, then adjust that system again and again as the world changed? If you've stayed with the story this far, take a second and tell me what you think the real source of that power was. And while you're here, please like the video, subscribe, and leave a comment telling us where you're listening from. Because this history did not end in 1875, it is still here,